When 17-year-old Opal Clementine carved the first Bible verse into Wallace Beauregard's cabin wall, she had no idea she was about to save his soul and lose her heart. The October wind swept across the Wyoming territory like a restless spirit, carrying with it the scent of dying leaves and the promise of an early winter. Wallace Beauregard stood on his porch, watching the dust devil dance between the cottonwoods, his weathered hands gripping a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. At 34, he'd grown accustomed to the silence that filled his days, a silence born not of peace, but of a grief so deep it had carved hollows in his chest where laughter used to live. His boy, Thomas, had been gone 3 years now. Fever took him quick, same as it took his mother 2 winters before that. The cabin that once rang with childish squeals and Mary's gentle humming now stood as quiet as a tomb, its rooms echoing with ghosts and regret. Wallace had built this place with his own hands, dreaming of filling it with children's voices and the rustle of Mary's skirts as she moved through the rooms. Now it felt like a monument to everything he'd lost. "Papa, I'm scared," Thomas had whispered during those final hours, his small hand burning with fever in Wallace's calloused palm. "Ain't nothing to fear, son. Your mama's waiting for you on the other side." But Wallace had lied. He feared everything now: the empty rooms, the silent meals, the way his heart had turned to stone in his chest. He'd stopped reading the good book after the funeral, stopped attending Sunday service, stopped believing in a God who'd take a mother from her child, then take the child from his father. The leather-bound Bible that once held a place of honor on his mantle now gathered dust in a drawer, its pages unturned, its comfort rejected. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew him from his brooding. A rider emerged from the golden haze, Sterling Knox, the town sheriff, his badge glinting in the afternoon sun. Behind him, slumped forward in the saddle, was a slight figure Wallace initially took for a young man. Sterling had been a friend. Once, back when Wallace still believed in friendship, still believed in much of anything beyond the daily grind of survival. "Wallace," Sterling called out, reining in his mount. "Got a situation here, needs your particular brand of kindness." As the rider straightened, Wallace saw his mistake. This was no young man, but a girl, maybe 17, with hair the color of autumn wheat and eyes that held too much knowledge for her tender years. Her clothes were men's cast-offs, worn thin at the knees and elbows, and her face bore the pallor of someone who'd seen too little food and too much trouble. There was something about her posture, the way she held her chin high despite her circumstances, that spoke of pride carefully maintained in the face of adversity. "Name's Opal Clementine," Sterling said, dismounting with a grunt. "Found her sleeping in the church last night. Preacher Harlan says she's been there near a week, leaving before dawn, returning after dark. Won't say where she's from or where she's headed." Wallace studied the girl, noting the way she held herself, proud despite her circumstances, wary as a wild creature. Her eyes darted between the 2 men, calculating, measuring. She had the look of someone who'd learned to read danger in a glance, opportunity in a gesture. "What's that got to do with me?" Wallace asked, though he could already guess where this conversation was heading. "Winter's coming hard and fast. She needs shelter, and you've got more space than most." Sterling lowered his voice, stepping closer. "Besides, might do you good to have someone around. Place is getting too quiet, even for you. Mary wouldn't want you living like this." The mention of his wife's name hit Wallace like a physical blow. He'd asked people not to speak of her, not to invoke her memory in their well-meaning attempts to draw him back into the world of the living. The girl, Opal, fixed Wallace with a steady gaze. "I don't need charity, mister. I can work for my keep. I'm stronger than I look, and I know my way around a kitchen and a barnyard. I won't be a burden." Something in her voice, a tremor beneath the bravado, reminded Wallace of Thomas trying to be brave during thunderstorms. The boy would stand at the window, fists clenched, declaring he wasn't afraid while his whole body shook with terror. This girl had that same quality, fear disguised as courage, vulnerability masked by defiance. "I don't take in strays," he said, but the words lacked conviction. "She's not a stray," Sterling replied firmly. "She's a child in need, and you're a man with an empty cabin and a good heart, even if you've forgotten how to use it." Wallace felt the familiar weight of loneliness pressing down on him. The cabin seemed to mock him with its emptiness, its silence. What harm could one small girl do? And yet, the thought of disrupting the careful isolation he'd built around himself, like armor, made his chest tighten with something approaching panic. One night, he said finally, "Till we figure something else out." Sterling nodded, satisfied. "Obliged, Wallace. I'll check back tomorrow." As the sheriff rode away, Wallace found himself alone with the girl. She stood beside her horse, a tired, old mare that had seen better days, clutching a canvas satchel that seemed to hold all her worldly possessions. The satchel was carefully mended in several places, each patch a different fabric, telling the story of a life lived on the margins. "I ain't much for conversation," Wallace said, leading her toward the cabin. "And I don't abide disrespect or laziness." "Yes, sir. There's a spare room in the back." "Used to be." He caught himself before mentioning Thomas. "Used to be storage. Clean it out, and it's yours for the night." The interior of the cabin was spartanly furnished, but well-maintained. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its mantel bare save for a layer of dust where family photographs once stood. Opal's gaze lingered on the empty spaces, reading the story of loss written in dust and silence. She moved through the room with careful steps, as if afraid to disturb the ghosts that lingered in every corner. "I'm grateful for your kindness, Mr. Beauregard," she said softly. "I know it ain't easy, taking in a stranger." Wallace grunted, uncomfortable with gratitude. "Just don't make me regret it." That evening, they shared a simple meal of beans and cornbread. Opal ate with the careful precision of someone who'd learned not to waste food, while Wallace found himself watching her despite his determination to remain aloof. She had delicate hands, he noticed, but they bore the calluses of hard work. When she thought he wasn't looking, her fingers traced shapes in the air, letters, perhaps, or symbols he couldn't decipher. "You read?" he asked suddenly. She nodded. "My mama taught me, before she passed. Said words were the only treasure no one could steal." Wallace felt an unexpected pang of kinship. Mine used to say something similar. They lapsed into silence, but it felt different now. Less empty, more expectant. As if the cabin itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to break the spell of loneliness that had settled over its walls like dust. After supper, Opal retreated to her room while Wallace sat by the fire, listening to the soft sounds of her settling in. For the first time in 3 years, the cabin didn't feel like a mausoleum that he was nearly asleep in his chair when he heard it. A soft scratching sound, rhythmic and persistent, but when Wallace rose to investigate, he had no idea that by morning, his world would be transformed in ways he never could have imagined. Wallace crept through the darkened cabin, his bare feet silent on the worn wooden planks. The scratching continued, soft, deliberate, coming from the direction of Opal's room. He paused outside her door, listening. The sound was too methodical to be a mouse, too purposeful to be anything accidental. Through the crack beneath the door, he could see the faint glow of candlelight. The girl was awake, and she was carving? The realization hit him like a cold wind. She was carving into his walls while Wallace's hand moved to the door handle, anger flaring in his chest. He'd opened his home to this stranger, and she was destroying it. But something, perhaps the memory of his own desperate nights after Mary's death, when he'd nearly put his fist through every surface in the cabin, stayed his hand. Instead, he pressed his ear to the door and listened. "Be strong and courageous," came Opal's whisper, barely audible through the wood. "Do not be afraid or terrified because of them, for the Lord your God goes with you." Scripture. She was carving scripture into his walls, the anger drained from Wallace's body, replaced by something more complex. Confusion, curiosity, and beneath it all, a pain he'd thought long buried. He remembered Mary reading those same words to Thomas during his nightmares, her voice a gentle balm against the boy's fears. Wallace retreated to his room, but sleep eluded him. He lay in the darkness, listening to the rhythmic scratching, wondering what demons this girl was fighting that required such desperate measures. When morning finally broke, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, an unnatural quiet had settled over the cabin. He dressed quickly and made his way to the kitchen, where he found Opal already at work. She'd somehow managed to prepare breakfast: eggs from his chickens, bacon from his smokehouse, biscuits golden and steaming. The sight of food he hadn't prepared himself in 3 years nearly brought him to his knees. "Morning, Mr. Beauregard," she said, not meeting his eyes. "I hope you don't mind that you carved into my walls." The words hung between them like a loaded gun. Opal's hands stilled on the cast-iron skillet, her knuckles white against the dark metal. "Yes, sir," she whispered. "I did." "What?" She turned to face him then, and he saw tears threatening to spill from her eyes. "Because I was scared. Because the dark gets so heavy sometimes, and the only thing that helps is reminding myself that I ain't alone in it." Wallace felt his chest tighten. "You could have asked. Would you have said yes?" The honesty in her question cut him deeper than any blade. No, he wouldn't have said yes. He'd have turned her out into the cold rather than allow God's words to grace his walls again. "Show me," he said instead. Opal led him to her room, where the morning light revealed her night's work. There, carved into the wall beside her bed in careful, precise letters, were the words, "Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or terrified because of them, for the Lord your God goes with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you." The craftsmanship was remarkable, each letter perfectly formed, the depth consistent throughout. This wasn't vandalism, it was art. It was prayer made manifest in wood and faith. Deuteronomy 31 verse 6. Wallace said quietly, the reference coming to him unbidden from years of Sunday school lessons that Opal's eyes widened in surprise. "You know scripture?" "Used to." He traced one of the letters with his finger, feeling the rough edges where her knife had bit into the wood. "My wife, she loved that verse. Said it to our boy when he was frightened." "What happened to them?" The question was soft, careful, but it hit Wallace like a physical blow. He'd spent 3 years avoiding this conversation, turning away from well-meaning neighbors who wanted to help him process his grief. "Fever," he said simply. "First Mary, then Thomas 2 winters later. Left me with nothing but empty rooms and questions God don't seem inclined to answer." Opal nodded, understanding, flickering in her eyes. "My mama died of fever too. Papa, he took to drinking after that. Said God had abandoned us, same as everyone else." "What happened to your father?" "Winter of '84. Found him frozen in a snow drift, bottle still clutched in his hand." She wiped her eyes with the back of her sleeve. "I've been on my own since then, moving from town to town, doing what work I could find." Wallace studied her face, seeing his own pain reflected there. "Why scripture? Why not?" "I don't know, poetry or song lyrics. Because when the world gets too quiet, when the loneliness feels like it's going to swallow you whole, poetry don't have the power to pull you back. But God's words." She touched the carved letters reverently. "They remind me that even in the darkest valley, I ain't walking alone." The words stirred something in Wallace's chest, a long dormant ember of faith that he'd thought extinguished. He found himself remembering the comfort those verses had once brought him, the way Mary's voice had made them feel like promises instead of platitudes. "I should be angry," he said. "I know. This is my house. My walls." "Yes, sir. But I ain't angry." The admission surprised him. "I'm curious. You got any more verses rattling around in that head of yours?" A smile, the first genuine one he'd seen from her, transformed Opal's face. "A few hundred, I reckon." Over the following days, Wallace found himself drawn into an unexpected rhythm. Each morning, he'd wake to the sound of Opal moving through the cabin, preparing breakfast, tending to chores he'd long neglected. Each evening, he'd hear the soft scratching as she added another verse to her growing collection. By the end of the week, his spare room had been transformed into something approaching a chapel. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want graced." The wall above her bed. "Cast all your anxiety on him because he cares for you," curved around the window frame. "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you," stretched across the door frame. The verses weren't random. Wallace began to see the careful thought behind each selection. These were words chosen by someone who understood suffering, who had walked through valleys of shadow and emerged with her faith not broken but refined on Sunday morning. As he watched Opal trace the letters of Psalm 23 with her finger, Wallace made a decision that would have seemed impossible a week earlier. "Get your Sunday dress," he said. "Sir, we're going to church." Opal's eyes widened. I don't have a Sunday dress." "Then wear what you have. God don't care about fancy clothes." As they prepared to leave for the first church service Wallace had attended in 3 years, he caught sight of himself in the mirror. The man staring back looked different somehow, less hollow, more alive. The verses carved into his walls had begun to carve themselves into his heart as well. But as they walked toward town, neither Wallace nor Opal noticed the lone rider watching from the ridge above, a figure whose presence would soon test every verse of faith now gracing the cabin. Walls. The First Baptist Church of Cedar Ridge hadn't seen Wallace Beauregard darken its doors since the day they'd buried his son. As he and Opal approached the white-painted building, conversations died mid-sentence. Heads turned. Whispers rippled through the gathered congregation like wind through wheat. Preacher Everett Harlan stood at the church steps, his weathered face breaking into a smile that seemed to light up the entire morning. "Wallace Beauregard, as I live and breathe. Welcome back, son." "Preacher," Wallace nodded, his jaw tight with discomfort. Beside him, Opal clutched her worn Bible, the only possession she seemed to treasure above all others. "And Miss Clementine," Everett continued, his voice warm with genuine affection. "I'm glad to see you've found proper shelter." The service was a trial by fire for Wallace. Every hymn carried memories of Mary's sweet soprano. Every prayer echoed with Thomas's lisping voice. When Preacher Harlan spoke of God's mysterious ways, Wallace's hands clenched into fists. When the congregation sang Amazing Grace, he felt tears threaten for the first time in 3 years. But it was Opal who surprised him most. She knew every hymn by heart, her clear voice rising above the others with a purity that made even the most jaded parishioners turn in wonder. When Preacher Harlan asked for testimonies, she stood without hesitation. "I'd like to thank the Lord for his provision," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the sanctuary, "for leading me to a place where his word can take root and grow, even in the hardest soil." Her eyes found Wallace's as she spoke, and he felt something shift inside his chest. Not quite healing, but the beginning of it. After the service, the congregation gathered outside for their usual socializing. Wallace found himself surrounded by well-meaning neighbors, their faces a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Good to see you back, Wallace," said Willa Brooks, the town's most prominent widow and unofficial keeper of everyone's business. "And taking in that poor girl. Why, it's Christian charity at its finest." "Ain't charity," Wallace replied tersely. "She works for her keep." Of course," Willa nodded, her eyes sharp with speculation. "Though I do hope you're being careful. A man alone with a young woman. Well, tongues do wag." Wallace felt heat rise in his cheeks. "Miss Clementine is under my protection, Mrs. Brooks. Anyone who suggests otherwise will answer to me." His voice carried enough steel to make Willa step back, but the damage was done. He could see the speculation in other faces, the way conversations shifted when he approached. Small towns had long memories and short patience for anything that didn't fit their narrow definitions of propriety. It was Opal who saved him from further interrogation. She appeared at his elbow with a quiet grace, her presence somehow calming the tension that had been building. "Mr. Beauregard," she said softly, "I believe that's your horse getting restless." They made their escape, but not before Wallace caught sight of a familiar figure watching from across the street. Myron Cassidy leaned against the post office wall, his black hat pulled low over his eyes, a cigarette dangling from his lips. The man's presence sent a chill down Wallace's spine that had nothing to do with the October wind. "You know that fellow?" Opal asked, following his gaze. Unfortunately, Wallace helped her into the wagon, his movements sharp with sudden urgency. "Myron Cassidy used to run with a rough crowd down in Colorado. Heard he'd cleaned up his act, but men like that don't change. They just get better at hiding what they really are." As they drove home, Wallace found himself glancing over his shoulder more than once. Something about Cassidy's presence felt ominous, like storm clouds gathering on a clear day. That evening, as Opal worked on her newest verse, "The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." Wallace sat by the fire, his thoughts troubled. The peaceful routine they'd established suddenly felt fragile, threatened by forces beyond their control. "Mr. Beauregard," Opal's voice drew him from his brooding. "Are you worried about that man from town?" Wallace looked up to find her watching him with those two knowing eyes. "Maybe," Men like Cassidy don't show up in places like Cedar Ridge without a reason. What kind of reason? The kind that usually involves running from something or someone. Opal set down her carving knife, her face pale in the firelight. Do you think, do you think he's here because of me? The question hung between them like a sword. Wallace studied her face, seeing fear there, but also something else, guilt, perhaps, or recognition. Why would he be here because of you? Opal's hands twisted in her lap. Because I ain't been entirely truthful with you, Mr. Beauregard. About where I come from, about why I was sleeping in churches and moving from town to town. Wallace felt his chest tighten. What haven't you told me? I wasn't just running from poverty or loneliness, she whispered. I was running from him. From Myron Cassidy. The words hit Wallace like a physical blow. What? He was involved. With my father, near the end. After Mama died and Papa started drinking, Cassidy showed up with promises of easy money. Said they could make a fortune running stolen cattle across the territory lines. Wallace leaned forward in his chair. What happened? Papa got caught. Cassidy didn't. The law came looking for both of them. But Cassidy had already disappeared, left my father to face the charges alone. That's when Papa started drinking even harder, when he gave up on everything. And you think Cassidy's here for you? Opal nodded miserably. I saw him right before Papa died. He came to our place, said I'd grown up real pretty, said maybe we could work out an arrangement. Said I owed him for his partnership with Papa. Wallace felt rage building in his chest, not the cold, distant anger he'd carried for 3 years, but something hot and protective and immediate. What kind of arrangement? The kind a decent woman don't speak of, Opal said quietly. That's when I ran. Been running ever since. Wallace stood abruptly, pacing to the window. Outside, the night was black as pitch, filled with shadows that could hide any number of threats. How long ago was this? 2 years, maybe 3. I thought. I hoped he'd forgotten about me. Men like Cassidy don't forget. They just wait for the right opportunity. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed through the night. Wallace tensed, his hand moving instinctively to the rifle mounted above the fireplace. Get to your room, he said quietly. Lock the door. Don't come out no matter what you hear. Opal stood, her face white with fear. Mr. Beauregard, I'm sorry. I should have told you. Go. Now. The hoofbeat stopped just outside the cabin. Wallace counted at least 3 horses, maybe 4. Too many for a social call, too late for anything good. A knock echoed through the cabin. Slow, deliberate, mocking, and Wallace knew their peaceful interlude was about to end. Wallace lifted the rifle from its mount, checking the chamber with practiced efficiency. The knock came again, more insistent this time, accompanied by the low murmur of men's voices. Through the window, he could see the silhouettes of at least 4 riders, their faces hidden in shadow. Wallace Beauregard, came a voice smooth as snake oil. Open up. We need to have ourselves a talk. Myron Cassidy. Wallace had hoped he was wrong about the man's intentions, but hope was a luxury he could no longer afford. It's late, Cassidy. Wallace called through the door. Whatever. Business you got can wait till morning. A laugh echoed from outside. Cold, mirthless. Oh, I don't think so. See, I got reason to believe you're harboring something that belongs to me. Wallace's blood ran cold. Nothing here belongs to you. That pretty little filly you had with you at church today might disagree. See, her daddy and I had us an arrangement before he went and got himself killed. Leaves his debts unpaid, his obligations unfulfilled. The girl owes you nothing. Well now, that ain't for you to decide. The voice was closer now, right outside the door. Her daddy cost me a considerable sum when he got caught with my cattle. Someone's got to make good on that debt. Wallace heard the soft creak of floorboards from Opal's room. Despite his orders, she was listening. He prayed she'd have the sense to stay hidden. You got no legal claim on her, Wallace said, his finger finding the rifle's trigger. She's under my protection now. Your protection? Cassidy's laugh was like breaking glass. 1 man against 4? Those ain't favorable odds, rancher. Maybe not, but I guarantee you won't be riding away from here. If you try to take her. The silence stretched taut as a bowstring. Wallace could hear his own heartbeat, could smell the fierce sweat beading on his forehead. These were the moments that defined a man, when he had to choose between safety and what was right. You know what, Beauregard? Cassidy's voice had turned. Conversational, almost friendly. I like you. You got sand, standing up for a girl you barely know. So I'm gonna make you a deal. Not interested. Hear me out. The girl comes with us peaceful like, and we ride away quiet. No fuss, no bloodshed. You get to keep breathing, and we all go about our business. Wallace's jaw clenched. And if I refuse? Well, then we take her anyway. But first, we burn your pretty little cabin to the ground. With you in it. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Wallace knew these men, knew their type anyway. They'd kill him without hesitation if it served their purpose. But the thought of Opal in their hands, of what they'd do to her, I need. A minute to think, Wallace said. You got 30 seconds. Wallace's mind raced. For armed men against one. Even if he managed to drop Cassidy, the others would overwhelm him. But maybe, if he could create enough confusion, the soft sound of a door opening made his blood freeze. Opal appeared in the hallway, her face pale but determined. She'd changed into her one good dress, a simple blue cotton that had seen better days but still managed to make her look heartbreakingly young. What are you doing? Wallace hissed. What I should have done 3 years ago, she whispered. Facing my demons instead of running from them. Before Wallace could stop her, she walked to the door and lifted the latch. Mr. Cassidy, she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. I hear you've been looking for me. Cassidy stood on the threshold, his 3 companions flanking him like wolves. In the lamplight, Wallace could see the man's face clearly, handsome in a rough way, with cold eyes that seemed to catalog everything they saw. Well, Cassidy said, his gaze traveling over Opal with obvious appreciation. Look how you've grown up, girl. Your daddy would be proud. My daddy's dead because of you. Opal replied, her chin lifting with defiance. Your daddy's dead because he was careless. I warned him about getting too greedy, but he wouldn't listen. Cassidy stepped into the cabin uninvited, his men following. Now, you and I got some unfinished business to discuss. Wallace raised his rifle, but one of Cassidy's men was faster. The cold barrel of a Colt .45 pressed against Wallace's temple. Easy there, rancher, the gunman said. No need for anyone to get hurt. Cassidy smiled, revealing teeth yellowed by tobacco. That's better. Now, Opal, honey, here's how this is going to work. You're going to come with us, and we're going to ride out of here peaceful-like. Maybe find ourselves a preacher in the next town, make everything legal and proper. I won't marry you. Opal said, her voice like steel. Oh, you will. See, you got 2 choices. You can come willing, and maybe I'll let your friend here live. Or you can fight me, and I'll kill him slow while you watch. Then you'll still come with me, but you'll have his blood on your hands. Wallace saw the moment Opal's resolve crumbled. Her shoulders sagged, and tears began to track down her cheeks. You promise you won't hurt him? I promise he'll live to see another sunrise if you come quiet. Opal looked at Wallace, her eyes full of sorrow and apology. I'm sorry, she whispered. I brought this on you. I should have kept running. No, Wallace said, his voice hoarse with desperation. There's got to be another way. There ain't, Cassidy said. Life's got a way of collecting on debts, one way or another. As Cassidy reached for Opal's arm, Wallace made his choice. He drove, his elbow backward into the gunman's stomach, dove sideways, and brought his rifle to bear. The cabin erupted in chaos, shouts, gunfire, the crash of overturned furniture. But in the midst of the violence, Wallace heard something that made his heart soar. Opal's voice, raised not in fear but in defiant song. Yeah, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. The words she'd carved into his walls, the faith she'd restored to his heart, gave him strength. He rolled behind the overturned table, returned fire, and prayed that somehow, someway, they'd both live to see the dawn. But as smoke filled the cabin, and bullets splintered the wood around the verses Opal had so carefully carved, Wallace realized that some battles could only be won by those willing to lose everything. The gunfight lasted less than 2 minutes, but it felt like an eternity. When the smoke cleared, Cassidy lay motionless near the fireplace, a dark stain spreading across his chest. 2 of his men had fled into the night, and the third, the one who'd held a gun to Wallace's head, sat slumped against the wall, clutching a wounded shoulder. Wallace kicked the man's weapon away, then turned to find Opal. She stood pressed, against the wall where her carved verses caught the lamplight, her dress torn but her spirit unbroken. In her hands, she clutched the small knife she'd used for her carving, its blade now stained red. "You hurt?" Wallace asked, his voice rough with concern. "No," she whispered, then looked down at Cassidy's still form. "Is he?" "Yeah." Wallace knelt beside the body, checking for a pulse he knew he wouldn't find. "It's over." The wounded gunman groaned, trying to push himself upright. "You killed Myron Cassidy. There'll be hell to pay for this." "There'll be justice," came a voice from the doorway. Sheriff Sterling Knox stepped into the cabin, his rifle trained on the wounded man. Behind him came Preacher Harlan and 3 other men from town. "We heard the shooting from near 2 miles away." Wallace blinked in surprise. "How did you?" "Mrs. Brooks saw Cassidy and his boys heading this direction after church," Sterling explained. "Woman may be a gossip, but she's got good instincts about trouble. We've been riding hard to get here." Preacher Harlan surveyed the destroyed cabin, overturned furniture, bullet holes in the walls, blood on the floor. But his eyes lingered longest on the carved scriptures, somehow untouched by the violence. "The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still," he read aloud. Seems like both parts of that promise came true tonight. As Sterling and his men dealt with the wounded gunman and Cassidy's body, Wallace found himself alone with Opal for the first time since the ordeal began. She stood before the verse she'd been carving that evening, her fingers tracing the incomplete letters. "I never finished it," she said softly. Wallace looked at the partial scripture. "The Lord will fight for you. You need only to. We can finish it tomorrow," he said. "Together." She turned to face him, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I brought this trouble to your door. I should have kept running. Should have. Should have what? Spent your whole life looking over your shoulder." Wallace shook his head. "Sometimes running ain't the answer. Sometimes you gotta stand and fight. But what if more of them come? What if? Then we'll face that when it happens." Wallace reached out, gently taking her hands in his. "I spent 3 years running from my own demons, Opal. Running from grief, from faith, from anything that might hurt me again. But you showed me something I'd forgotten." "What's that?" "That even in the darkest valley, we don't walk alone." Over the following weeks, as autumn gave way to winter's first whisper, the cabin slowly healed from the violence it had witnessed. Wallace and Opal worked side by side to repair the damage, patching bullet holes, replacing broken furniture, restoring order to their small sanctuary. But the most important healing happened in quieter moments. Each evening, they continued the ritual of carving scriptures into the walls. Each morning, they read them together over coffee and breakfast. The verses became a living testament to faith restored, hope reborn. "For I know the plans I have for you," declares the Lord, "plans to prosper you and not to harm you, to give you hope and a future." Wallace carved those words above the kitchen window, where the morning light would illuminate them each new day. As he worked, he thought about Thomas, about Mary, about the way grief had nearly buried him alive. The pain would always be there. He understood that now, but it no longer defined him. "Mr. Beauregard," Opal's voice drew him from his thoughts. "What is it?" "I finished the verse. The one from that night." He followed her to the wall where she'd been working. There, carved in perfect letters, were the complete words. "The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." Exodus 14, verse 14. Below it, in smaller script, she'd added, "For Wallace and Opal, who learned to stand still and let love find them." Wallace felt his breath catch. "Opal, I know it's presumptuous," she said quickly, her cheeks flushing pink. "I know I'm just a stray you took in, and you're a good man who deserves better than." He silenced her with a kiss, gentle and reverent. As a prayer. When they broke apart, both were crying. "You're not a stray," he whispered against her forehead. "You're a gift, a reminder that God ain't done with me yet." "Are you asking me to stay?" "I'm asking you to marry me. If you'll have a broken-down rancher who's still learning how to hope again." Her answer came in the form of another kiss, this one filled with all the promise of spring after a long, hard winter. They married the following Sunday in the First Baptist Church of Cedar Ridge, surrounded by the same congregation that had watched their story unfold. Preacher Harlan performed the ceremony, his voice rich with joy as he spoke of love that grows from shared trials, faith that deepens through adversity. As they exchanged vows, Wallace thought about the walls of his cabin, now covered with carved promises and prayers. Each verse told part of their story, his journey from despair to hope, her transformation from frightened runaway to beloved wife. But it was the newest addition that meant the most to him. Above their marriage bed, Opal had carved the words that would guide their life together. Two are better than one because they have a good return for their labor. If either of them falls down, one can help the other up. Ecclesiastes 4 verses 9 to 10. That evening, as they sat on their porch watching the first snow of winter dust the mountains, Wallace marveled at the changes a single season could bring. The silence that had once felt like death now hummed with life. Opal's soft humming as she mended a shirt, the crackle of fire in the hearth, the gentle whisper of wind through carved words of faith. "You know," Wallace said, pulling his wife closer against the evening chill, "I used to think God had forgotten about me. And now," Wallace smiled, his heart full of gratitude for the girl who'd carved scripture into his walls and love into his heart. "Now I think he was just waiting for the right moment to remind me that his plans are always better than mine." As the snow began to fall in earnest, covering the valley in pristine white, the cabin glowed with warm lamplight and carved promises, a testament to the truth that even the hardest ground can bloom when tended with faith and love. That if this tale of carved scriptures and carved hearts has touched your soul, don't forget to share your thoughts below and let us know if you believe love can truly carve its way through any hardship. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from today. We love hearing from folks all across this great country.